Welcome to the Trails Regional Library's Missouri Bicentennial Virtual Speaker Series. My name is Dr. John Taylor, and I am a professor of history at the University of Central Missouri. History program at UCM and the communication program at UCM are assisting the Trails Regional Library with this virtual speaker series. Our speaker today is Greg Olson. Greg received his MA in history from the University of Missouri, Columbia, and an MFA from the University of South Dakota. He's the author of two University of Missouri Press books, Voodoo Priests, Noble Savages and Ozark Gypsies, The Life of Folklorist Mary Alicia Owen, and The Iowa in Missouri, which won the Missouri Humanities Council's Governor's Humanities Award for Distinguished Literary Achievement. He is also the author of three titles in Truman State University's Notable Missourians for Young Readers series. His most recent book, Iowa Life, Reservation and Reform, 1837 to 1860, published by the University of Oklahoma Press, was named the Kansas Notable Book in 2017. Olson is currently serving as a 2020 Center for Missouri Studies Fellow, which is sponsored by the State Historical Society of Missouri. Please welcome Greg Olson.
All right, thank you, John. Okay, it's good to be here. Thank you also for the invitation. This talk is very much related to another talk that I do about Indigenous history of Missouri. And I talk about the different tribes, and it starts not with the ancient Missouri Native Americans, but it starts with European contact, which we date in Missouri, we date to about 1673 when Marquette and Joliet came to Missouri. So some of you have probably heard me give this talk previously and may notice some similarities. We'll go ahead and go here. Well, I like to start out with just a little bit of basic information. I've done, like I said, versions of this talk for quite a while now, and I'm always kind of struck by the fact of how little we, and when I say we as Anglo-Americans, really know about Native people, not only in Missouri, but across the nation. So I just start out with a few basic facts, things that people may or may not know. But for instance, did you know that there are 573 federally recognized Indian tribes in the United States? It's kind of an interesting thing because Native people are the only ethnic group that I know of that has to, or that their ethnicity is regulated by the federal government. And maybe we can talk about that as we go on. But it was established as a law really very early in the United States history when we became a country and got our independence from Britain. Immediately it was dictated that only the federal government could sign treaties with Native Americans, buy land, make deals with Native Americans. The states to this day don't have that ability. And in the process of all the treaties that it took to get Native land into federal hands, the tribes became more and more heavily regulated. And so that is how you end up with federally recognized tribes. Sometimes you'll hear about Native kids who can maybe get some money to help them out with school. Native people have access to what's called the Indian Health Service, which is similar to the VA. It's government-run health facilities, kind of like the Veterans Administration has for veterans. But my understanding is that the only people who have access to those government programs are people who are registered in one of these 573 federally recognized tribes. And that number is changing all the time, as occasionally there will be new tribes added. There are dozens and dozens of Native organizations, bands, groups, nations that are not federally recognized, and that doesn't make their members any less legitimate. It just means that they don't have that piece of paper that says they're federally recognized. And also, too, what's really interesting to me is that almost half of that 573 are different bands and nations in Alaska, and that's something I had no idea. There are no federally recognized Indian tribes based in Missouri today, and by based in Missouri, I mean to say that there's no organized settlement. There's no reservation in the state of Missouri. We're one of the few one of the few states west of the Mississippi River that does not have an Indian reservation, and we'll talk a little bit about how that came to be later. However, there are several tribes that have historic connections to the state of what is now Missouri, and as you can see on the slide, those include the Chickasaws, the Sioux, Delawares, Foxes, the Illinois, which actually the Illinois is a kind of a confederacy of several tribes. And there's the Iowa's, Kickapoos, Omahas, Osages, Odos, Sacs, Foxes, and Shawnees. And did you know, this is a surprise, Native Americans did not become US citizens until June 2nd, 1924. I believe there are some exceptions, and I think maybe some different bands and nations were allowed to become Native American citizens before. I've done a lot of work with the Iowas, and I've done quite a bit of research into the fact that 50 Iowa men fought for the Union in the Civil War, and yet they were not citizens. And they were by far not, not the only natives. There were many, many native, I think 20,000 native men, fought in the Civil War. And they fought for America in every conflict after that. And yet they didn't become citizens and weren't able to vote until 1924. So that's just a little background about Native people, and just very brief, all over the country. Missouri is an interesting place. What is now Missouri is an interesting state because it has all of these rivers that come together, a place of many rivers. And so because of that, even before we had European Americans and Europeans living in Missouri, this was a place where a lot of cultures and a lot of people came and went. I just heard a Native speaker recently talk about rivers being superhighways. It's where a lot of trade happened, it's where a lot of travel happened on rivers, and so naturally natives followed those riverways to hunt, looking for food, going out to trade. Natives were big traders even before Euro-Americans came here, and it was the riverways that always kind of brought them to, that made them congregate here in Missouri. There is a historian named Stephen Aaron who has written a book called American Confluence, and he's called this part of the country the Confluence region, not only because it was a confluence of rivers, but those rivers brought a confluence of people. And so when you talk about the Native Americans that lived here at any time in the past, whether it was before or after European conquest or European contact, that was always fluid. People were always in motion. It was not static at all. If you think about where you live, your house, maybe if you live in town on a street, just think about the last 10 years, how many people on your street maybe have moved in and moved out, coming and going, and people have always done that. And because of the rivers, Missouri was a place where that was particularly the case. I love this map because it sort of shows what rivers meant to Native Americans. And if you look at it, it sort of looks like maybe a tree or the veins in a leaf or something like that. And what it is it's a map that is pretty much covers the same territory as the map I just showed you. And if you can see my mouse, you see that there is a line here, a very strong, prominent line that runs up the center of this map. That is the Mississippi River. And then down at the bottom here, there's a line that runs up what would be the left side of the map. That is the Missouri River. And then we have at the very bottom, that is the Ohio River. So you can see that while, natives didn't see rivers the same way Euro-Americans see rivers, they were very knowledgeable about them, and they knew how they connected the watersheds and everything. You'll notice sprinkled around the map there are what look to be like chocolate chip cookies. These little, well, here's one right here. These little things that are round and they've got little dots in them. Those are village sites. And then this is a map that more or less shows you what the constellation of nations in Missouri would have been at first contact. This would have been when Marquette and Joliet traversed the Mississippi, or traveled the Mississippi River. And then you can see over too on the western part of the state, I put in Lafayette and Johnson County to give you a sense of just the geographical relationship there. The most prominent nations at that time would have been the Great Osages, the Missourias, and then over in the eastern side, you have the Illinois Confederacy. I only found out recently why there were Great Osages and Little Osages, and a lot of times the Americans saw them as two different nations, and in fact, they're all one nation. They're all Osages. The Osages, like most other nations, are divided into clans and different groups. A lot of them have like for instance, the Iowas have Bear Clan, they have Buffalo Clan, and then often the groups of clans are divided into larger groups. And that's to kind of share power and keep things balanced. And when Europeans first came across the Osages and they asked the Osages, or probably more likely asked another tribe, well, who are those people? They misunderstood what they were being told. They were told that they were Osages from a certain clan, and the Europeans thought, oh, Little Osages. So they started calling that particular village or small group of villages Little Osages, and then of course all the other Osages, I guess, became big or Great Osages. The Little Osages there was a group of Osages that lived right up here in what would be, kind of around Van Meter State Park. And they and the Missourias were very, very close. They had villages very close together, and they were allies. And they were able to pretty much control any kind of trade that went on the upper Missouri River. If you were a native tribe, or later if you were a European trader and you tried to get up the Mississippi or the Missouri River to trade with some people further up in what would now be Nebraska and the Dakotas, the Missourians had a say about that. And if you were traveling on the Missouri River, they would often stop you, and you would have to pay a toll, or they would prevent you from going up there at all. They were that strong. The Great Osages really controlled most of this southern part of Missouri, but they also controlled a large part of land in Arkansas, what is now Oklahoma, what is now Kansas. They, at one point, actually, they were one of the few nations for a while when the fur trade started. They got larger rather than smaller and took up more territory. At the time of first contact, probably, they were located down on the Osage River, which is the river that dips down from the Missouri River. And of course, now part of it is the Lake of the Ozarks. Excuse me. You had smaller nations then. Up in northwest Missouri, you had the Odos, and then in very northern Missouri, you had the Iowas. And the Missourians, Odos, and Iowas were all at one point the same people. They're called the Chewette Sioux. And that's because they all spoke the same Siouan language, Chewette Siouan language. And then the Winnebagos or the Ho-Chunks were also a part of that group. So they kind of went off on their own. Then over on eastern Missouri here, you had the Illinois Confederacy, and that was a huge group of, there's, my understanding is there's a debate. Some people say that they were one tribe, and that each nation within that larger group was a clan or, you know, a splinter group. But some of the nations you may have heard of would be the Kaskaskias, the Miamis, the Peorias. Those were all Illinois nations. They had come in from the southern Great Lakes. They were not, I guess what you would say, indigenous to that area. Not long before Europeans moved in, the Illinois had come in, and they'd actually pushed the Ioways out. Ioways had a village right at the confluence of the Des Moines River and the Missouri River, and the Illinois Confederacy had pushed them out, forcing the Ioways back up into what's now Iowa. And that's in part because they were being pushed by from behind by the Iroquois. It's also because they were interested in getting into the buffalo hunt. They wanted to control a lot of times nations would move around because they wanted to control trade. And of course, there were very few, if any, buffalo east of the Mississippi River. The Illinois Confederacy wanted to get in on that buffalo trade, and they wanted to push out all the middlemen. And they figured out if they could live in eastern Missouri, they could, you know, they could have that control. And at one point, they did successfully control a lot of the trade on the Mississippi River from, you know, the lower Great Lakes, like what would now be Chicago, down to the Arkansas River. So they were another very powerful group. And then you have the Chickasaws, and they were they were a Mississippian people. They're kind of a remnant of the Mississippian culture that gave rise to the great town of Cahokia. But they had been living in what is now Alabama and Mississippi, and over time they sort of migrated to the north and the west. So their land was partly in Missouri, but it was also partly in Kentucky and Tennessee and southern Illinois. And then the Quapaws were actually more located down around the Arkansas River, but they roamed and had land in northern Arkansas, and the land they considered to be theirs crept up into southern Missouri. I should say too that the Osages and the Quapaws are part of the same Siouan group, and that's called the Guian Siouan group. And they claim to have, in the late woodland period, come down the Ohio River. And the Osages claim to have been part of the Cahokia complex, and also were a Mississippian group. But the Quapaws had gone down into the southern Mississippi Valley, so they were around, but they were not part of that. So that's kind of what the geography of Missouri was when whites first came here. And these were all very different cultures. I mean, you had peoples from, you know, some of them, of course, were related, like the Ioways, Otos, and the Missourias. But then you had the Osages, which came from another group originally, and then you had the Illinois, who came from a completely different group. The Sac and Foxes would come in later, and they were Algonquins. So I think another misconception that's often that people often think of when they think of Native people is that they all have the same culture. And that's one of the reasons I point out in the beginning that there are 573 federally recognized indigenous tribes. There are a lot of different tribes, a lot of different languages, a lot of different cultures. And these huts, lodges, they would be called, are just an example, you know, that they had different housing, different materials, you know, everything was so related to the land on which they lived that a lot of their culture came from the land. And so the lodges in which they live were made out of what was available at the time. This one on the left, I think that's made out of reeds and mats, you know, so these were probably people who lived close to the water. and were able to collect enough reeds to weave into mats. The one on the top right is an Iowa lodge called a Chakaduthan. And you can see that's probably made out of willow, maybe some grasses, maybe it's kind of hard to tell. Down below, there's a sack and fox bark house made out of tree bark. And I think that, I don't know for sure, but I think that may be a ceremonial house. But it's interesting because it has a gable, much like a house we would see today. Since we're talking about Western Missouri and the area around Lafayette and Johnson County, I thought I would just point out some points of interest that many of you may already be familiar with. But I might start up here on the Missouri River, right up in here, with the area around Van Meter State Park. That was a really important place in pre-contact Missouri before Europeans came. And part of it is because, you know, you see the Grand River coming down from the north and the Sheridan River coming down from the north, and it was on the Missouri. So it was a very strategic place for the Little Osages and the Missourians to live and conduct trade. And then, of course, Fort Osage is just outside Lafayette County near Sibley. And that was built by the United States then in 1808. And for a while, that was the farthest fort west that the United States owned. It was built as part of a treaty with the Osages. They wanted to protect, you know, the Osages actually kind of liked having the fort there because they felt that, you know, it gave them importance, you know, because they felt important because they were one of the few tribes in Western Missouri that had a fort nearby. But also along with the fort, there was a trading house, and you've heard of George Sibley. He was a trader who owned, the United States set up what they called trading factories, and that was a way of controlling trade. The United States told the Osages, well, we do this so that you won't be taken advantage of by unscrupulous traders. But it also turned out to be a great way for the United States to control the goods that the Osages got, and, you know, make sure that they didn't get too many weapons through trade. It was a controlling thing. And then down here, closer to down on the Missouri, or I'm sorry, down on lower down on the Osage River, you have the Great Osage villages. And for much the same reason that Bourgmont built Fort Orleans and the United States built Fort Osage, there was Fort Carondelet, built in 1795, and that was built by the Choteaus, Pierre and Auguste Choteau, the St. Louis traders, who had a monopoly for quite a while. Off and on, they had a trade monopoly with the Osages. Pierre Choteau had lived with the Osages for decades, had married into powerful Osage families, had Osage children, and they convinced the Spanish government to allow them to build Fort Carondelet, and named after the governor of the territory of Louisiana. But it was essentially it was a trading factory, or a trading house is what it was. It was called a fort, but it was certainly not much of a defensive position. So what happened? So we've been talking pretty much about how things were before white European contact. And I know when I was a kid, I had this idea that native cultures were sort of driven out or defeated, you know, with air quotes, by Indian wars. You know, that the military events were always what defeated native people. And in Missouri, that was not always the case. In Missouri, as in much of the nation, native people were more often subjected to cultural warfare than they were to military warfare. If I can do this briefly, native culture, the view as I understand it, is sort of a holistic view in that all things are related. You know, you may So I had these bullet points: economy, environment, cultural, and spiritual expression. Those things are all related. I mean, you make a pot to from clay to trade to someone, but that pot is made from clay that came from Mother Earth. And of course, to a lot of the nations, that very clay, the part of Mother Earth, was sacred. And so they would, some sacred um, spiritual expression would go into some of those pots. The same thing about farming. In the spring, when it's time to plant the corn, there are only certain people who can plant the corn. I think with the Ioways, you have to wait for the Buffalo clan to plant the corn. But anyway, those people, they knew the songs that had to be sung. Certain songs had to be sung when the corn was planted. Certain spirits had to be addressed. So even planting and farming was a spiritual thing. Um, and when the United States moved in, as I said, for instance, take a place like Fort Osage as an example. Well, the United States started to control point one on that bullet point list. They started to control the economy of the Osages and the Missourias by regulating their trade. And then one of the main reasons that they wanted to control trade with Native people is because quite early on, the Americans realized that Native people didn't have any money. They really didn't have anything of value except land. And of course, the Americans wanted land, and they soon found out that the quickest way to get a Native nation to give up this land was to render them in debt, and they did that through the trading factories. So by allowing Osages only to trade with a certain trader who had a government license at a certain place, there was no competition, so prices, of course, would be exorbitant. But the Osages needed those things, especially as more people started moving in. There was less game because the area would become overhunted. And so survival became more difficult, and slowly the United States was able to kind of render a lot of these nations dependent on them for their livelihood and control their money. And then it got to the point, it was just this cycle of indebtedness. And eventually nations would become so in debt that they had no choice but to sell the claim to land they had. And this was all, talk a little bit about the doctrine of discovery. This is kind of a European legal concept that made its way over to America. And so I'm sure most people have heard the story about Christopher Columbus coming to the Caribbean, and he's claiming the land for Spain. Well, what gave him the right to do that? Well, previously Europeans had come up with this legal construct, I guess, that they had used in the Middle East when they conducted the Crusades to fight in the Middle East. And it was basically, it said that Christian nations or Christian monarch states, that were based in Christianity, had the legal right to take over and possess and own the land of any non-Christian population. And like I said, they worked that out in the Middle East. You even have places in Europe, like Ireland, where that sort of thing was executed, where indigenous people were driven off their land, their farmland, and then suddenly became subservient. And that kind of brings us to the Louisiana Purchase. While the Spanish and the French were in Missouri long before the United States, they were mostly interested in trade and extracting resources from the land that's now Missouri. But what the Americans wanted was the land itself. And one thing that I have only recently come to understand about the Louisiana Purchase is that, we say we bought what are these 800,000 square miles or whatever for $15 million. Well, we didn't buy the land, actually. This is a quote from Colin Calloway, who says that in the Louisiana Purchase, we did not buy the land itself, but we bought the preemptive right to negotiate with indigenous people for the title to the land. So in essence, when the United States took over the Louisiana Purchase, we didn't own any of the land. The only thing we could do was prevent Saxon foxes or Ioways or Osages from selling that land to any other country. They could only sell it to the United States, and basically that's what the preemptive claim was. We became, in a sense, a landlord, I guess maybe is the closest way I can think of it. We being Anglo-Americans, because we had what was called right of discovery over the land, but natives had what was called right of occupation. And by, as I mentioned earlier, by getting native nations in debt, they were often, more than willing to give up their land, and that's how we changed it from us being kind of the, the right of discovery to the right of owning the land. And then, pardon me, then here we are with a slightly different geography of native people living in Missouri after the Louisiana Purchase. So in the north, you see the Ioways have moved down a little bit, and the Saxon foxes have moved in. What happened is that the Missourians were, Mike Dickey in his book on the Missourians gets into this. The Missourians were basically defeated in a series. They got into this long war with the Saxon fox. So they moved up to what is now Nebraska with their relatives, the Osages. And that left kind of a vacuum in northern Missouri. So you had the Ioways moving down, and you had the Saxon fox moving down. Little Osages, after the Missourians left, the little Osages moved down away from the Missouri River down closer to the Osage River. And the Great Osages had sort of this big split between the time of first contact and the time of the Louisiana Purchase, and that was pretty much due to the Chouteau family, where they were the Chouteau family, because as I mentioned earlier, had married into the nation, had become relatives of some of the leaders, and the Chouteaus were really favorable and I think related to a leader named Pahuska. And they gave him all the breaks, and they were able to bring wealth to him through their trade. But then they were also able to convince the Spanish, when Missouri was a Spanish colony, to look favorably on Pahuska as the head man, the main leader of the Osages, when, according to Osage tradition, that was not at all true. So several Osages moved down into what would be now Oklahoma and Arkansas, down along the upper Arkansas River, and they followed Claremont and another leader down there. Then you have an interesting thing, the Shawnees. You'll notice that the Quapaws are still there. The Chickasaws, not so much in the Boot Heel anymore, but that you have three other new tribes: the Shawnees, the Delawares, and the Kickapoos. And those nations had actually been brought into Missouri by the Spanish. As Europeans moved across the river, mostly French Europeans moved across the river and founded towns like St. Louis and St. Genevieve and Kaskaskia. You had a lot of trouble with fighting between French settlers and the Osages. And at the same time, you had fighting between the Americans, the Shawnees, the Delawares, and the Kickapoos east of the river, where America now owned that land after they gained independence. And so the Spanish thought, what would really be good was if we would invite these nations to come in, and they could become kind of a buffer between the European settlers and the the Great Osages, which of course caused no end of problems and fighting between these people. But the Shawnees and Delawares received land down by Cape Girardeau, and then the Kickapoos were sort of informally received some land. I don't believe they ever got a land grant, but they settled more over here along the White River, more down in the Ozarks. And here are two of the treaty makers. We have William Clark and Pierre Choteau, who acted as Indian agents. Remember when I mentioned that when we bought the Louisiana Purchase, it gave us the right to do treaties, to conduct treaties to get the land into the hands of the state of Missouri. When Missouri became a state in 1821, there were still a lot of outstanding native claims to the land. Only 3 nations had given up any land in Missouri before 1821, and that was the Sac and Fox. They'd given away this small cession up here, number 50, and then the Osages gave away everything except this small little 22-mile strip over on the west side of the state. You see the name Royce Sessions. So what we're looking at is a map of all the different treaties that had to take place. There were 21 of them all, 21 in all between 1804 and 1837. 21 different treaties had to be conducted and signed with 13 different native nations before Missouri was, the United States had title free and clear to all of what would be Missouri. But yeah, it was a long process, and a lot of the time, it was done through coercion, and people were put a lot of pressure, and again, a lot of that was economic pressure to get this land into American hands. So for a certain part of time, we were kind of an illegal settlement. White people were settling on land that, really until 1837 was not in the hands of the United States. I would just point out, so Johnson and Lafayette counties would pretty much be right here. That means that the land that now makes up those 2 counties was pretty much freed up only by one treaty, and that was the treaty with the Osages in 1808. And that was the treaty that led to the construction of Fort Osage. That was the treaty that William Clark signed to build the fort, and I mentioned that a little bit earlier. But the Osages in 1808 gave up this huge chunk of land, really going from this dotted line all the way over to the Mississippi River. Never mind that a lot of this land down here still was legitimately claimed by the Quapaws. They were just cut out of the process, and to my knowledge, were never ever reimbursed for the land that they owned in southern Missouri. And then in 1839, we have Lilburn Boggs, the governor. This is a document you can find in the Missouri State Archives, and he made it pretty much through a series of intercourse acts, made it illegal for Native people to be in in Missouri without the written permission of a white European Indian agent. That law, as far as I can tell, pretty much stayed on the books until probably 1905, 1910, and then it was just taken off the books. But there were a lot of restrictions. They couldn't trade, they couldn't come into the United States to hunt. They were just pretty much excluded unless they had the permission of a white person. And then just kind of in wrapping up here, I see our time is about done. And then you have things happening in Missouri once the natives had all been removed from Missouri. Then you have the removal of native of cultural history. And so, with St. Louis, I think a lot of people know that St. Louis was once called the Mound City. There were, I think, 22 mounds, something like that, in the downtown area of St. Louis alone. And those were all but one of them were destroyed. And this is a picture of Great Mound, Big Mound being taken down in 1839. And I end my talk by just pointing out the fact that despite all of this, that despite that natives have been removed from Missouri and that a lot of what they left behind has been destroyed, Native people are still here and they're still defying contacts. These are the picture on the right is an artist. You've probably heard the phrase Indians are stoic, you know, all the pictures you see of Indians are not smiling. So this artist did a whole video of smiling Indians, and that's a still from that. And then on the left here, you have a photographer who did a whole series of what she called urban Indians, concrete Indians, and she took pictures of Native people in there. In their regalia, powwow regalia, or in their traditional ceremonial clothing, even in contemporary settings. Missouri still has Native people today, as we saw at the very beginning. There are 27,000. On the far left, one thing I would point out, there is still one mound in the city limits of St. Louis that was not torn down, Sugarloaf Mound. And in 2009, the Osages bought that. And you can see in the picture, there was a house. They've since torn that house down. And they're not claiming necessarily that their ancestors built that mound, but because they had the resources, they thought it was important to preserve it. The Osages have also been working on their own written language, and I think that was put together probably about 15 years ago, or even less than that. And then a plug for the for the People powwow in Jefferson City, this picture in the middle. I mentioned already, because Native people in Missouri have no reservations or no communities, really large communities, things like powwows and other events that happen today are important because the people can come together and they can celebrate their culture in a way that maybe they can't do the rest of the year. And then finally, I've got some resources here if you're interested. More and more, the best place to go for information about different tribes is actually go to the tribal websites. In the middle here, Lance Foster in Iowa, actually he now is the vice chair of the tribal council of the Iowas of Kansas and Nebraska, has put together a very informative website. And then I mentioned Mike Dickey's book over here, The People of the River's Mouth. There are three or four books in the University of Missouri Press has put out in the Missouri Heritage Reader Series that are real easy, informative, good reads about Native Americans in Missouri. And so, John, I think that is really all I have that I'd put together to prepare. So,
Greg, thank you very much for that informative presentation. Just got a couple of questions for you. What drew you to study Missouri's indigenous people?
Well, as you mentioned earlier, I started out by getting interested in the Iowas. And I'm a native of Iowa. And it turns out, I did not know this at the time, but I grew up within about a dozen miles of what in 1650 was a pretty sizable Iowa village. And as an adult, I realized I really didn't know anything about Iowa Indians. I didn't really even know there were Iowa Indians until I was embarrassingly old. And we were always told Iowa meant, what was it, great, beautiful land or something like that. And so it was curiosity about the people. And also too, specifically when I was working on the Iowas, I found out that there were some really good basic books, but I wanted, for instance, to find out information about a particular guy called Mahaska. And there really wasn't anything. So I started digging into it and writing. And then, one thing leads to another, how you make a small decision. And I think the thing that has made me decide to work on a project that really encompasses the whole state rather than just one nation is because of the bicentennial coming up. And I'd really sort of hoped that the state's bicentennial in 2021 would be an opportunity for more of a revisiting of our history, and maybe a revisiting of some of the things about our history in Missouri that aren't so pleasant. And it started with this look at the treaties and all the different treaties that had to be signed, and the process by which that took place.
Thank you. My final question, why should Missourians today remember the significant indigenous people who lived in what became the state of Missouri?
Well, I think the short answer to that is that Native history is U.S. history, Native history is Missouri history. Because in the research I'm doing right now on this cumulative history of indigenous Missouri, I'm finding out that a lot of indigenous people played a really big part in the way Missouri came about as a state. For instance, I only touched on the fact that for decades, the Osages controlled trade south of the Missouri River and west of the Mississippi River. And because of them and the Shotos, you have the creation of a town like St. Louis. St. Louis was a trade town for a long, long time. You know, they kept trying to get people to farm, but everybody was into the trade. And so I think that, you know, in the past, maybe we haven't paid quite as much attention to the role that various groups played. You know, I think we're finally doing more work on African Americans, understanding the role they played in Missouri, and natives as well. And I think, you know, I think that there's an unwritten history of a lot of people who had more strength than we give them credit for, had more agency than we have in the past given them credit for. So, and I think more will come out over time, but I think they played an important role, and it's not to be overlooked, in my opinion.
All right. Thank you very much.